lesson 4, preschool. In this lesson, we're going to focus on ADHD in the preschool child. Now, let's be honest. ADHD is the waking state of the preschool child. Most children in this age group have difficulty concentrating for extended periods of time. They're easily distracted, they're constantly seeking stimulation. And while they all have these symptoms, the hallmark symptoms of ADHD, not all children in preschool have ADHD. So despite the commonality of the ADHD-like symptoms in this early developmental period, children with authentic ADHD do differ from their peers. When observing a preschool classroom, you can tell if there's a child with ADHD. His activity level is usually little or a lot higher. His own impulsivity is just a little bit more intrusive, sometimes a lot more intrusive, and he just never seems to tire. So in many preschool classrooms, for example, they are still taking naps. Well, these children with ADHD really struggle with nap time. They just cannot settle. While the other children may lay still and quiet and even go to sleep, the child with ADHD needs a lot of supervision and oftentimes has to have their mat very close to the teacher to make sure that they stay down. If they're not constantly supervised, they may lie awake and interrupt other children. They may keep the other kids awake, and they may just simply be unable to lay still for any period of time long enough for the teacher to allow the other students to get through their nap time. So they're going to keep their neighbors awake, and they're going to be making noises and doing other things that are disruptive to the other students. So preschoolers with ADHD also tend to be those children who have some difficulty regulating frustration and managing some of their social interactions. These are the kids who oftentimes bite or hit their classmates, not because they're aggressive kids or because they're mean or mean-spirited in any way, but it's because they respond in a very impulsive way in some of those kinds of situations, especially situations that don't go the way that they're wanting. Even when they have good verbal skills, these kids tend to react behaviorally as opposed to verbally, simply because that is their impulse. So despite some of these indications of ADHD in the school-age child, it's relatively rare that a diagnosis of ADHD is actually made this early. As you can imagine, many of these non-diagnostic characteristics that I've been talking about could be indicative of other factors. For example, children who are unable to self-regulate may have difficulty settling for a nap or managing interactions with other students, not because they have ADHD-like symptoms, but because they just can't settle themselves. We know of children, as an example, we know of children who continue to use pacifiers and things like that when they're at home to settle because they just haven't gained those intrinsic abilities to calm themselves. When they're at school, they probably don't have their pacifier, and so it's difficult for them to self-regulate and calm themselves without that external support. So because of these issues, because of the challenge of making the diagnosis, because of the relatively limited information the child, him or herself, can provide, a diagnosis in the preschool ages is pretty rare and doesn't usually happen. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, it's just not very common. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about school-age kids, kids between, by the time that they've started kindergarten and through at least middle school, and that's the time frame that we typically see our diagnosis of ADHD made, and that is primarily because the differentiation between what is normal and what is ADHD-like symptoms really begins to differentiate at that point. They really begin to separate at that point. In the preschool age child, there's not a whole lot of difference between what is typically expected from preschool age children and what we see in kids with ADHD. So the summary here is ADHD does exist in preschool age children. It is very difficult to diagnose. When it's there, oftentimes it's very obvious. But if it's not very obvious and you're thinking that it looks a little bit like it, but you're not completely sure, that's usually when we wait and see what happens. It doesn't mean that interventions aren't put into place, which we'll talk about in Unit 4. So it doesn't mean that we don't do something about it, but it certainly does mean that we may pause and wait a little bit before we make the diagnosis. Okay, so I hope that helps and gives you an indication or some kind of image about what the preschool age child looks like, especially the preschool age child with ADHD. Come back for lesson 5, because that's where we really get into what ADHD looks like in our classical sense.